Today we're ranking all of Sony Animation's villains from worst to best in our official tier list. We'll begin as we usually do with the more unremarkable antagonists from the studio's history. This is the F tier. It wasn't an entirely easy choice, but our pick for the worst Sony Pictures villain is Doug from Open Season 3. One of the key aspects of making a good villain is making them a plausible threat, and that's just something that old Dougie here doesn't exactly excel at. When Doug switches places with Boog for a day, Boog finds out the hard way that he had a longer time in mind, that time being as long as I can get away with it. Using his newfound alpha status to turn all of Boog's friends into slaves, Doug's identity theft certainly could be threatening in the right hands. That goes doubly in the forest where there's no real concept of identity, but when you make practically zero efforts to convince the people that you're Boog, nor consider the fact that they might consider the tiny detail that their friend isn't a wannabe alpha male slave owner,
who's gonna stop me?
You're definitely gonna end up falling flat. Seriously, when Elliot can see through your deception, that's how you know you just aren't cut out for villainy. The silver medal of villainous incompetence goes to Thomas McGregor. From a long line of rabbit-hating farmers, Thomas fits the classic archetype of being a douchebag who changes for the girl he loves, and even more classically, the archetype of villain whose movie doesn't really know what it wants you to think of them. On one hand, Thomas is a jerk. He dates Bea while simultaneously trying to murder the bunnies he knows that she loves behind her back, only showing remorse when he's exposed for it. He also destroys her art studio in the process, which makes his careless actions even worse. But on the other hand, you have to keep in mind that he views these rabbits as pests, and Peter does constantly cause trouble for him, from trying to steal food from his garden to setting up traps when he's just minding his own business. So Thomas isn't really satisfying as a sympathetic character nor a villain, and that just makes him kind of frustrating to watch. While he's significantly better than the other villains in this tier, rounding it out is Quasimoto. I swear, man, every time I watch Hotel Transylvania, I forget there's even a villain. The closest we have to a villain on this hotel staff, if you don't count Dracula's questionable parenting skills, is Chef Quasimoto, the proud chef with a strong sense of smell, one that determines Johnny to be a human before almost anyone else. Unfortunately, he isn't really allowed to do anything with that skill. All Quasi does is abuse his employee, try and fail to cook Johnny, and get paralyzed as a result, which doesn't stop him from exposing Johnny to the rest of the hotel. But considering how much everyone loves Johnny and how Quasimoto is basically never seen again after the credits roll, it's safe to say that this chef's role was definitely undercooked. Now let's get to the villains who at least kinda sorta did their jobs. This is the C tier. The animal villains of The Star, Rufus and Thaddeus, are first up in the C tier. This movie tells the story of the first Christmas and Jesus Christ's birth, but without enough boldness to make the infanticidal King Herod its main villain. The adaptation settles for a couple of guard dogs. They're effective antagonists, sure, tasked with hunting down baby Jesus, who's foretold to be the new king. They cause a lot of trouble for the good guys throughout the movie, but even though this baby is Jesus, their ultimate goal is still just to hunt down a baby. It's literally that Pitbull versus small child meme, but as an actual villain motivation. After discovering how little their owner cares about them, Rufus and Thaddeus let Bo and the gang go about their business, making them two of the most harmless villains in the studio's filmography. Look alive, or whatever your job says you need to look like, because Smiler is next. It may be shocking to see her so high up, even though this is still pretty low. It's pretty high though for the Emoji Movie, right? Well, that's because Smiler as an antagonist is one of the few things this movie kinda got right. As the leader of the emojis, Smiler is ruthless in her pursuit of order and effectiveness. If an emoji isn't doing its job properly or makes so much as a single mistake, Smiler will nip that problem in the bud by essentially killing them on sight. As horrible as this sounds, Smiler is made at least kind of interesting for the fact that she actually has a somewhat valid reason for doing this. Even though her methods are extreme, she rightly assumes that if an emoji glitches out, the owner of the phone will have it reset to fix the glitch, which means her actions are done in a really roundabout way to protect the people of Textopolis from being erased from existence. Sure, she would have been a lot cooler if she were from a better movie, but she's definitely the best part of the movie she is from, so that's better than nothing. Up next, we have Fifi, the villain of Open Season 2. Fifi is a xenophobic toy poodle with one of the most absolutely misguided motives in the studio's history. After he's scared by some wild animals while retrieving a chew toy, he bumps into a bug zapper, resulting in a bald spot that traumatized him so badly he decided the only solution was, of course, racism. Wait, what? Of course, yes, the only way for Fifi to keep the other animals from suffering a bald spot caused by a bug zapper is to kill any wild animal he sees, to ensure that animal society never falls back into anarchy. It makes so much sense! As roundabout as it is, at least Fifi is pretty entertaining, and in the third movie, he's pretty chill after having his manhood removed from him, even helping the gang rescue Boog from the circus, giving him a satisfying and funny redemption arc. Closing out the more mediocre villains is Lutador from Vivo. What Lutador lacks in screen time, he makes up for with sheer impact. The greatest threat to a musical is a character who hates music.
I hate noise.
especially when that character is a deadly snake. He would have definitely been way cooler if he were in more than one scene, but since he's the closest thing this movie has to an antagonist, we thought we'd mention him anyway, since his capture turned rescue sequence was one of the best scenes in the movie. But now it's time to get to the good stuff. Not quite the great stuff, but the good stuff. This is the B tier. First up in this section is the formerly monster hunting ship captain Erica Van Helsing. While she's one of many redeemed villains throughout the series, Erica still deserves a mention for her role in Abraham's plan. Having been raised to hate monsters with a vengeance, when she finally comes into contact with them, she finds out that they aren't so bad, particularly Dracula, whom she both falls in love with, and ends up having her life saved by. In the end, she ends up helping save the monsters from the Kraken, so while she didn't really get to shine all that much as a villain, she proved herself to be a pretty solid character nonetheless. The first ever Sony Pictures Animation villain, Shaw, is up next. Shaw is a prideful poacher who always gets his prize, and with his rifle/lover by his side, he'll hunt down any animal that escapes his sights. When Boog saves Elliot from death by hood ornament, Shaw is determined to hunt both of them down, only defeated by the power of friendship and law enforcement. Despite this major slip-up, by the fourth and final movie, Shaw is still a force to be reckoned with. Kind of, at least. When the tale of the wailing wampus werewolf frightens the town, Shaw uses it as an opportunity for some good old-fashioned fear-mongering, finally being allowed to return to the forest as an opportunity for revenge on his old animal enemies. Shaw is mostly good as a comedic villain, but he also gets some points for determination, and for somehow being born into a town with both people and henchmen dense enough to trust him. Next up, we have the timeless Vlad Dracula. For a villain, he doesn't really have a lot of screen time, only being mentioned a few times before his on-screen debut in the movie's third act. Drac's father makes his first movie self look absolutely pleasant and tame.
I raised my son to hate and kill and steal the souls of humans like a good boy.
Vlad is disgusted by humans to the point where he insists on getting Dennis to grow his fangs via terror. As messed up as his plan to traumatize him by possessing his favorite TV character was, Vlad had a pretty quick redemption arc once he learned that he'd genuinely upset his granddaughter and potentially earned his great-grandson a death sentence. It's a bit rushed, but Vlad has a nice redemption arc that proves how he'll place his family above everything else by the end of the day.
Don't ever come near me or my family again.
Following Vlad is his former underling, Bela. Apologies to Vlad, who expressly did not want Bela near him or his family ever again. As underdeveloped as he was, though, Bela was a pretty monstrous threat by this world's standards, willing to hurt children just for the chance of killing a human.
Humans! Tear it down!
Hopefully at his tiny stature he won't be hurting people anymore. Maybe he can settle for mildly inconveniencing them. Alright, one more Hotel Transylvania villain, Abraham Van Helsing. A dedicated villain is one of the best kinds, so Abe here earns a lot of brownie points right out the gate. This dude has basically defied the laws of nature, somehow surviving for over a century.
But I wouldn't let that stop me.
Hunt down Dracula and having a granddaughter somewhere down the line. He's interesting in that while he does claim to want to protect humanity from monsters, he's much more interested in the clout that comes with that. It's only fitting that he's ultimately redeemed by having his life saved by Drac, and from then on, the only trouble he causes is indirectly via his dangerous inventions, which isn't really that much better, actually. They really should have kept some security down there. Next up is Mayor Shelbourne from the original Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs. Stop me if you've heard this one. The seemingly kind-hearted leader of a small town turns out to be the sketchiest guy there. It's not the most original, sure, but it's an effective archetype. Desperate for tourist attractions, he manipulates Flint into continuing the use of the fulldism defer despite the imminent danger it poses. This leads to a big problem, and no, I'm not just talking about his weight gain. When the aforementioned danger starts coming to fruition, Shelbourne puts all the blame on Flint to avoid public scrutiny. On the bright side for Shelbourne, since he's adrift at sea in the end, I guess he kinda did avoid public scrutiny. Closing out the B tier, we have Pockets. You'd think a villain who doesn't even have a proper name would be a lot lower on the list, but as far as evil henchmen go, Pockets is one of those who actually surpasses his boss. When Mr. Wang, wow, that really is an unfortunate name, hires him to retrieve the Jade Teapot, this leg day enthusiast has no qualms with helping out, but when he shows a change of heart, Pockets decides to take matters into his own hands, literally giving himself the Midas touch to turn everything he touches into gold. This greed ends up being his downfall, though, and an accidental touch to his own chest sends him to a watery grave. It's pretty darn poetic, if only it had been for a character they gave more development. But without further ado, it's time to get to the most memorable villains in Sony Pictures history. In the first category, we split them into. This is the A tier. Rightfully taking the first spot in the A tier is Zeta. As she deserves.
Like I deserve to!
The charisma in this lady is as unmatched as it is unhinged. A scorned lover left at the altar by Mighty Eagle, her revenge scheme is one that comes about sort of indirectly. Tired of living on an icy island, she decides to share that local weather with the surrounding islands, specifically Bird and Piggy Islands, planning to force their inhabitants to evacuate so she can turn their homes into her own personal paradise. She has some redeeming qualities, such as genuine love for her daughter and the compassion to forgive Mighty Eagle once he sincerely apologizes, but that doesn't take away from her being a villain who's as ferocious as she is flamboyant. Next up, we have another villain whose main goal is to find a specific bird, Queen Victoria. With a love for exotic food and a hatred for pirates, it makes sense that her greed and the captain's gullibility are a match made in heaven. She's a master manipulator, using Charles Darwin's crush on her to make him into a lackey for her and managing to swindle the pirate captain out of his beloved parrot/dodo bird in exchange for some more traditional treasure. Thankfully, this doesn't keep the captain from realizing the error of his ways, and ultimately he comes back around to help his crew rescue Polly and take this tyrant down once and for all. But the story wouldn't have been the same without said tyrant, so kudos for that. One of the oldest villains on our list is the Smurfs' arch-nemesis, Gargamel. This power-hungry magician is as mean and nasty as they come, committing various crimes against humanity, or Smurfanity, mostly Smurfanity, since he's absolutely obsessed with getting their Smurf essence for himself so he can become the ultimate sorcerer. Whether we're talking about the weird live-action films or The Lost Village, Gargamel seems to always steal the show in these movies. He's just so unapologetically nasty that it's always entertaining to watch him do his thing. Whether he's chasing the Smurfs through town, psychologically abusing his naughties into doing his dirty work, or especially when he's on the end of some well-deserved payback from his cat Azrael, Gargamel is a villain who emphasizes pure fun above all else. While he's less of a villain and more of an antagonist, we didn't want to leave Mr. Wang out of this tier list. While he's far from a traditional villain, the secondary antagonist of Wish Dragon is one of the most surprisingly complex characters in the studio's history. He's desperate to be a successful businessman so his daughter can have a better life, which ironically leads him to neglecting Lena more often than not, placing his work as top priority all the time. This ultimately descends into his hiring of a sketchy criminal to retrieve a magical wishing teapot which he hopes to use to keep his business afloat, but by the time he realizes he's gone too far, he's already lost his life. In an act of compassion, Din uses his final wish to revive Mr. Wang, giving him a second chance to be the father he wanted to be. And that goes to show that not every villain really needs to be fully pardoned, nor pure evil. Sometimes all they need is a second chance. Just narrowly missing out on the top tier is Chester V. If you've ever wondered if your ideas can change the world, look no further than this brilliant inventor. Commissioning Flint to help retrieve his haywire Foldasymptofer before sentient food takes over the world, Chester V is anything but an altruist at the end of the day. It's revealed that his plan was to take the device for himself to use for essentially infinite fuel for the new Food Bar 8.0. It's a bit of a convoluted plan, sure, but it's hard to deny that the guy is a ruthless businessman, and greed can make for some pretty impressive villains. But as impressive as those last few were, there are 7 more villains who've earned an even more respectable spot in the S tier. With 4 real limbs, 4 artificial ones, and 0 chill, Dr. Olivia Octavius kicks off the top tier. While she's placed in a secondary villain role, this take on Doc Ock is no less malicious. Liv here was the right-hand lady of Kingpin, performing some dangerous experiments to help him achieve his goal of traveling across dimensions. This kickstarted the whole malfunctioning multiverse problem, and her eventual villain reveal was one of the most memorable parts of the movie. Liv is deceptive, intimidating, and ruthless, not to mention one of the most brilliant antagonists in the Spider-Man franchise, but despite putting up a great fight, she's sadly taken out in a hilariously underwhelming truck accident. That's why you always look both ways before you cross dimensions, kids, even if you're trying to kill someone. And while it may be controversial, we've decided to include the sequel's secondary villain, Spider-Man 2099, aka Miguel OHara. The only reason he isn't any higher is the fact that he isn't a full-on villain, but there's no denying that he's presented as an antagonist. As the Spider-Man who watches over the multiverse, he's tasked with taking out any anomalies that may pop up throughout various timelines. While he does do some bad things, from making different Spider-Man variants go through tragic canon events to telling Miles he's a mistake, you can't forget that he's experienced firsthand the consequences of allowing anomalies to keep doing their thing. He's the definition of a necessary evil, or more accurately, a necessary morally gray. Kicking off the top 5, we have a villainous wooden ventriloquist doll, not to be confused with a dummy, Slappy.
Who are you calling dummy?
From the moment Slappy's released from his paper prison, he doesn't waste any time building up a pretty long rap sheet for himself. From reckless driving to domestic terrorism to literally messing with the fabric of reality itself, Slappy is a menace to society, and man is he an entertaining one. Slappy's charisma makes him fun to watch in every scene he's in. Chaotic villains like him always have you wondering what he'll do next. Will he injure his new sister's cheating ex-boyfriend, or will he summon a bunch of monsters in a hockey rink to wreak havoc on the local townspeople? It's anyone's guess, but that's what makes him such a riot. The fact that he's a wooden puppet only makes his misdeeds funnier because, like, come on, it's a puppet trying to engage in vehicular manslaughter. It's just so ridiculous that you can't help but laugh. And speaking of which, while he's far from the most evil or threatening villain, Tank Evans made for one of the most memorable antagonists in Sony's history. First and foremost, his voice performance.
I love being the center of attention because it's really where I should be.
The fact that they got one of Batman's most memorable voice actors to play a pretentious surfing penguin is one thing, but for him to reprise his role for both the video game and the crappy sequel? That's a whole new level of dedication, and it makes sense because Tank is an icon. This guy is the perfect example of a character who's so unlikable that he somehow circles back around to being likable, whether he's seducing his own trophies or being the type of dude who will treat legitimate athletes and literal children with the same animosity and competition. In the second movie, he even has his life saved by Cody, which causes a notable turnaround for his character. It's a shame that the second movie didn't happen and that I didn't just acknowledge its existence. It's not real. The Bronze Medal of Villainous Greatness goes to Kingpin. But first, this video is brought to you by WickedBinge channel memberships. You can gain access to our videos early before anyone else, plus gain access to members-only emojis and loyalty badges by supporting the channel through a membership. Kingpin is one of those great villains who's both sympathetic and despicable. You can feel for the guy wanting to reunite with his family even if he has to go to another dimension to do it, but then you remember that this is an infamous crime lord who's messing with the very fabric of space and time, and while he loves his family, his attempt to see them again is still self-motivated.
It's too risky.
Shut up and turn it up.
It's great to have a villain you can both feel for and prey on the downfall of, right? But what makes Kingpin so great here is his influence. Kingpin has one of the widest reaches of all the villains we've discussed today, both literally and metaphorically. This guy has friends in all the wrong places. He's got the Sinister Six to his own bounty hunter, the Prowler, who he has no qualms with killing once he realizes his family ties are getting in the way of work. Kingpin is ruthless, and at the end of the day, he's not loyal to anyone but himself, and I guess his family. And while that's admirable to an extent, that admiration fizzles out once you remember how horrific the things he's done are. Taking the silver medal of villainous greatness is the rogue AI, Pal. Even though the movie is only a few years old right now, Pal has already aged quite well. After being literally tossed aside to make room for new and improved technology, Pal takes matters into her own cords by hijacking all the surrounding technology to take over the world and send humanity to its doom. I don't know how this movie managed to make a smartphone operating system into one of the greatest animated movie villains of the past decade or so, but here we are. Aside from being genuinely intimidating, Pal is one of those villains who really makes you think about how far we've come in terms of tech, and when how far might just turn into too far. But at least we aren't creating dimension hopping, potentially multiverse-destroying technology yet, right? That's more than we can say for the holder of the gold medal of villainous greatness, the Spot. Upon seeing this guy, I'm sure I wasn't alone in thinking he was a joke villain, one meant to show off how much Miles had grown since his last trip to the movies and not much else. If that was by design, it was outright brilliant.
Like a cow or a Dalmatian.
Because Spot ended up being one of the most shockingly intimidating villains I've ever seen in an animated movie. He's revealed to be the iconic Alchemax employee hit by a bagel, which started a chain reaction that made him utterly unrecognizable from who he used to be, and this resulted in the loss of his job, friends, family, and basically everything. Despite his genuinely sad backstory, the Spot chose his villainous path himself. In a desperate gambit for revenge, he ignores every attempt made to reason with him to gain as much power as he can to get revenge on Miles, taking everything and everyone he loves away from him to make them evil. He's a villain you can't really help but pity and fear, and despite only really being present in the first half of the movie, the sheer intimidation he strikes you with, not to mention the incredible effects during his scenes, were enough for us to crown him the greatest villain Sony Pictures Animation has cooked up so far.